For years, the people of Willow Creek laughed at her, whispered about her, and dismissed her as nothing more than a joke. But today, everything changes. After enduring ridicule and scorn for so long, the quiet, overweight woman everyone underestimated returns, and she's not here to be ignored. What happens when patience turns into power, and mockery meets a force no one saw coming? Watch as one woman reshapes an entire town, revealing strength, authority, and secrets hidden for years. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Now, get ready to experience the story of Willow Creek like never before. No one had taken me seriously for years, and maybe that was my fault. I had walked through the streets of Willow Creek so many times, shoulders hunched against the weight of stares, of whispered jokes, of outright laughter that seemed to follow me like a shadow. I had learned early on to make myself small, to carry my basket in front of me like a shield, to keep my head down when I passed the general store, the saloon, the post office. Everyone had known my name, my size, my habits, and everyone thought they owned the right to mock me. But they didn't know me. Not really. They had no idea of what I was capable of, what I had endured, or the life I had left behind long before I arrived in this dusty, sun-bleached town. The moment didn't start with anything monumental. It started with Otis Clay, as it always did, and a careless comment that landed like a pebble in my stomach. I was waiting outside the bakery when he passed by, tipping his hat with that false politeness that hid a sneer. "Watch it, big girl," he called. "Wouldn't want the bread to break under your weight." The chuckle that followed from the women on the porch, the children pointing from the steps, the men who barely tried to hide their smirks. It had all been so familiar, so predictable, I almost didn't flinch. Almost. But something in me had changed. The years of smiling politely, of pretending not to hear, of pretending not to care, had worn thin. My patience, tested daily for decades, finally cracked. I didn't answer him aloud. I didn't throw the basket at his feet or scream in the street. I simply looked at the horizon. The prairie stretched far beyond the town limits, wide and open, and for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of a plan that had been simmering in the back of my mind, quiet but unyielding. I had come to Willow Creek wanting a quiet life. I had wanted to disappear into the rhythm of small-town living, to marry, to tend a home, to quietly be. But the town had other plans for me. The town had laughed at me, year after year, as if my body, my presence, my very existence were a joke for them to enjoy. And the more they mocked, the more I learned. Not their secrets, not their gossip, but their weakness. People think a person like me is harmless. They think if you're fat, if you're quiet, if you shrink yourself to fit the world around you, you can't possibly hold power. They don't realize that it's precisely because they underestimate you that you survive long enough to gather it. That day, the laughter was louder. Otis had stepped too far, as always. I could feel the stares boring into my back as I carried the basket inside the general store. It wasn't the words that cut me, it was the assumption that I would take them quietly. I could feel my hands steady, as always, though inside, fire roared. The people of Willow Creek had no idea that the fire had never left me. I had just learned to hide it, to wait, to let it burn quietly until the right moment. The moment had come. By noon, I was ready. I began arranging my home, gathering the things I had kept stored away, items not ordinary by any measure. Herbs, salts, old ceremonial weapons, relics from my past life that seemed useless to anyone else but vital to me. Each piece was placed with meticulous care, a ritual I had performed hundreds of times before. The town didn't know. They couldn't possibly understand the purpose behind these actions. But I did. And soon, they would. Outside, the air was hot and dry, carrying the familiar scent of dust and prairie grass. I walked to the window and looked across the town. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch at the faces staring at me, the sneers, the whispered jokes. For the first time, I allowed myself to think of them not as enemies, but as pawns, waiting for a move they didn't see coming. And from the distance, I could see the hint of movement, tiny, almost imperceptible. Dust rising on the horizon. The first signs of what I had summoned. They would come for me, yes. But they would not come alone. I turned from the window, letting the sunlight catch the lines of my face. I felt the weight of every stare I had endured, every insult, every laugh that had been aimed at me, and I let it settle into something useful. Resolve. The town had made a mistake that could never be undone. They had assumed weakness where there was strength. They had assumed fear where there was strategy. And most importantly, they had assumed ignorance where there was experience. By the time the dust cloud became visible to anyone else, it was too late. The town had already begun to tremble, unaware that everything they had taken for granted was about to change. I had waited for this day, and now it was finally here. No one saw it coming. The first whispers of panic began when the dust became more than just a distant shimmer. I saw them, emerging over the rolling hills, moving with a discipline that seemed impossible for so many horses and riders to maintain. I had counted them before. They were more than I had expected. 200 strong, every figure painted, mounted, a force that radiated command and power. And yet, the people of Willow Creek had no idea what they were seeing. No one knew the truth, and that ignorance was about to shatter. Malachi's hand brushed mine as he stood behind me, his jaw tight, eyes wide. He had lived his life believing in the quiet order of the town, in the small rituals of a predictable world. But even he couldn't deny the sight unfolding before us. I didn't need to speak. The way he watched, the tension in his shoulders, told me everything. He understood that this was beyond anything he had imagined, yet he didn't fully grasp it. That was fine. He didn't need to. Not yet. I let the sunlight fall across the kitchen, illuminating the small ritual I had prepared. Salt lines, carefully placed herbs, and tools that seemed mundane to the untrained, I were positioned with precision. These were the markers, the signals, the silent commands that my people recognized. In moments, they would respond as if the very air carried the language only we could read. The first hoofbeats were distant at first, a steady drumbeat against the prairie. My stomach tightened, a familiar prelude to confrontation. I had faced worse than this, yes, but not here, not in a place where my life had been measured by ridicule and laughter. Now the town would see. They would feel the weight of their assumptions. Otis Clay, ever bold when he believed himself untouchable, stepped onto the porch of the general store. His confidence wavered, though he did not yet recognize it. He looked to the horizon with squinted eyes, trying to see what I had already seen for hours. I allowed myself a small, subtle smile. He had no idea. He never would. I had prepared for this moment for years, not in Willow Creek, but long before, in a life that the town could never imagine. I had walked among warriors, had trained in ways that would make their laughter seem meaningless. I had known strategy, discipline, and power that they could never comprehend. And now, I would bring that power here, to this town that had laughed at me, that had mocked me, that had underestimated the very ground I walked on. By the time the first figures became distinguishable, people began to murmur. Mothers drew their children closer, men fumbled with their hats, as if to steady themselves. The reality that approached them was not a story they had prepared for. My warriors moved as one, and the dust cloud grew into a storm of inevitability. Malachi swallowed hard, his hand tightening around mine. He had known me as quiet, reserved, harmless. But he had also seen the fire in my eyes when injustice crossed the line. He didn't yet know the scale of what I commanded, nor the legacy that traveled with me across the prairie. But soon, even he would understand. I stepped to the window, letting the morning sun illuminate my figure against the kitchen. I wanted them to see me, not the caricature they had laughed at, not the shadow of a person they had assumed I was, but the truth of my presence. And I smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of lips that held centuries of patience and planning. The first of my warriors reached the edge of the tree line, halting to form a perfect formation. Horses stamped impatiently, nostrils flaring, muscles coiled with strength. They had been trained for coordination, for discipline, for a purpose that extended far beyond the boundaries of this little town. I had called them here, and they had answered without hesitation. Otis Clay's mouth fell open, a silent gasp that betrayed the terror he could not yet articulate. Mrs. Henderson clutched her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles whitened, as if she could physically hold the world together through panic alone. The town did not yet understand, could not yet comprehend, what it meant to summon a force of this magnitude. And then I stepped from the shadows of the kitchen into the sunlight, every eye snapping toward me. My back straight, my head held high, and the fire in my gaze evident to anyone who dared look. They had spent years seeing me as small, unimportant, laughable. Now, they were seeing the truth, a leader, a warrior, a force that commanded attention and demanded respect. I raised my hand slowly, a signal I had used 1,000 times before in lands far from Willow Creek. The response was immediate and precise. Every rider, every horse, every weapon rose in unison, a demonstration of discipline that echoed across the prairie like rolling thunder. No, they were not here to harm the town. They were here to honor, to acknowledge, to assert the presence of something far greater than the people of Willow Creek had ever imagined. The first sound of awe rippled through the townsfolk, a quiet tremor that ran from porch to porch. Then came fear, raw, biting, undeniable. They realized, too late, that every laugh they had thrown at me, every whisper, every cruel word, had been an invitation to witness a reckoning they were wholly unprepared for. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My presence, my patience, my command of this gathering said everything. And as I stood there, basking in the sunlight, the truth became undeniable. They had underestimated me for decades, and now, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. By the time the dust cloud fully arrived, the town's realization was complete. They were not witnessing a joke, a harmless spectacle, or the return of a quiet, overweight woman. They were witnessing the awakening of a leader, someone whose strength and authority had been hidden in plain sight for years, now manifested in a force so formidable that even the bravest among them could not ignore it. And it had only just begun. The town of Willow Creek had never felt smaller, not even during droughts, nor when the river had overflowed and forced the streets to flood. But now, as I stepped onto the wooden porch that creaked under my weight, I realized just how fragile their sense of security had always been. They had built their lives on assumptions, on petty judgments, and now those assumptions were crumbling like dry mud under the heat of truth. I didn't speak to them yet. Words were unnecessary. The horses stamped, nostrils flaring, hoofs kicking up clouds of dust that rose in spirals around their riders. I could see the fear in the eyes of the townsfolk, the panic barely restrained in their trembling hands. Some clutched children to their chests, others pressed themselves against the wooden walls of their shops as if proximity could shield them from what was coming. Otis Clay was the first to make a sound, a high-pitched squeak that drew the attention of every eye in town. His pride had carried him for years, bolstered by mockery and the silent approval of those who thought him clever. But now, standing before this force of 200 warriors, his confidence evaporated. I let the silence stretch, thick and suffocating, letting the weight of my presence settle into every corner of the street. Malachi stood beside me, rigid, his hand gripping mine, but his eyes, those wide, startled eyes, finally reflected understanding. I had always known he would be the one to follow, to trust the plan even without comprehension. I didn't need him to speak, to explain, to negotiate. He would see the truth, as all of them would. The riders began to fan out slowly, forming a precise semicircle around the town. Not an attack formation, but a demonstration of control, of presence, of undeniable power. Each movement was measured, deliberate, a testament to training and discipline far beyond anything Willow Creek had ever encountered. Their leader, a tall figure atop a black stallion, held himself with authority that demanded respect. Every warrior mirrored his stance, eyes forward, hands steady on reins and weapons alike. I turned my gaze to the horizon, scanning for any unexpected threats. I knew some among them would have attempted to interfere, to provoke, to assert their misguided courage. But none dared approach, not yet. My warriors would respond instantly if needed. They had waited, hidden, disciplined, and loyal. Their patience matched mine, their resolve unshakable. The sun caught the edge of my hair as I raised a hand subtly, the signal barely visible to anyone but my allies. The response was immediate. Horses shifted, riders adjusted, and the air carried a collective energy that even the seasoned men of Willow Creek couldn't ignore. Fear now mingled with awe, the two emotions twisting together as tightly as the dust that rose from the ground. I could feel the weight of every insult, every mocking glance, every whispered comment from years past crystallizing into purpose. Every slight against my size, my voice, my presence, had prepared me for this moment. I had endured because it had been necessary. I had allowed the town to underestimate me, not out of weakness, but strategy. And now, the strategy had matured into a revelation they could not deny. A group of townsfolk gathered near the saloon, whispering frantic questions to one another, trying desperately to rationalize the impossible. Who are they? One muttered, voice shaking. Why are they here? I allowed myself the smallest smile, inwardly acknowledging their ignorance. They would learn soon enough. Not everyone, perhaps, but enough to understand that the quiet, overweight woman they had dismissed was the orchestrator of what unfolded before them. Malachi's voice finally broke through my thoughts, low and cautious. Are they really going to? I didn't answer immediately. There was no need. My gaze swept the semicircle, noting every detail, the alignment of the riders, the poised readiness of their weapons, the unspoken communication that flowed between them. It was perfect. Too perfect. The first murmurs of recognition came from a few who had once left our home early in the morning to chase whispers of my past. They had seen hints, heard fragments of stories that they dismissed as legends. Now, confronted with reality, their disbelief collided with comprehension. The woman they had mocked had been more than they could have imagined. She had been, all along, a force they had neither expected nor could they resist. I stepped down from the porch, letting my boots sink slightly into the dirt, and moved toward the edge of the semicircle. The town fell silent, every eye fixed on me. I could feel the energy of the warriors behind me, disciplined and ready, yet restrained. My voice carried across the street without needing to raise it. This town has made its judgments for years. I began, steady, deliberate. It has decided my worth by the size of my body, the softness of my voice, the quiet of my presence. It has mocked what it did not understand. And it has been wrong. The pause was heavy, filled with the weight of every insult endured, every laugh suffered, every moment I had been dismissed. I let it hang in the air, thick and suffocating, before continuing. I have returned not to beg for acceptance, not to apologize for being what I am. I have returned to show what has always been mine, and to remind this town of the consequences of underestimating power cloaked in silence. Otis Clay's jaw went slack, sweat beading on his forehead. He tried to find words but could not. No words could explain the horror and awe that collided in his mind. Mrs. Henderson fainted into her husband's arms. Children clutched their mothers, eyes wide and trembling. The town had begun to understand, slowly, painfully, that the woman they had ridiculed was now in control. I raised my hand again, signaling a small but unmistakable movement. The warriors responded instantly, shifting formation, moving with fluid precision that suggested both readiness and restraint. Every motion spoke a language that Willow Creek did not know, a language of loyalty, discipline, and power. And then I let them see the first hint of what had been hidden for decades. From the folds of my coat, I drew a standard, a symbol of my lineage, a mark that would strike awe into the hearts of anyone familiar with my history. The emblem shone in the sunlight, a stark contrast against the dust and the wooden structures of the town. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Some recognized it, others did not. But all understood the meaning. This was no ordinary woman. And in that moment, I knew the tide had turned. Willow Creek would never see me the same way again. The sun was high, beating down on the wooden planks of Willow Creek's main street, but it did little to warm the tension that hung like a thick fog over the town. I could feel it in every glance, every shallow breath the townspeople took. They were acutely aware now that the quiet, overweight woman they had dismissed, laughed at and mocked, was no longer a figure to ridicule. I was a presence they could neither ignore nor underestimate. Malachi's hand remained in mine, but his body was taut, an unspoken acknowledgement of the gravity of what was unfolding. I could sense the questions flooding his mind, the disbelief mixing with awe. He had loved me as the woman everyone else had seen, but now he was being forced to see me as I truly was. Someone who had lived a life far beyond Willow Creek. Someone whose patience had been honed into strategy, whose silence had concealed power. The warriors behind me shifted, a subtle wave of movement that betrayed neither anxiety nor hesitation. They were trained, disciplined, and utterly loyal. Their presence was the embodiment of centuries of tradition and authority, carried into the heart of a town that had long forgotten humility. And they waited, silent but vigilant, for my command. I let my gaze sweep across the crowd. Otis Clay cowered near the general store, his earlier arrogance replaced by terror so raw it made my pulse quicken with a strange mix of satisfaction and relief. Mrs. Henderson clutched her husband's arm as if he could shield her from the impossible reality. Even the men who had once laughed openly at my size now shrank under the weight of their own misjudgments. I had to let them feel it. Not just the presence of my warriors, not just the symbol of my lineage, but the inevitability of what I represented. Every insult they had thrown at me over the years had been a stone in a foundation I had been quietly building. Now, that foundation rose before them, undeniable and absolute. From the edge of the semicircle, my brother, the leader of this formidable force, approached on his black stallion. His gaze locked on mine, the kind of connection that transcends words. The townspeople watched in confusion, unable to discern the relationship, but their fear deepened when they saw the recognition in our eyes. A shared history, an unspoken understanding of authority, of power, of command. I raised a hand toward him, and the signal was instant. The formation tightened slightly, creating a subtle, yet unmistakable, cordon around the town. Not to attack, not to intimidate further, but to assert control. To show that every element of this moment had been anticipated, orchestrated, and executed with precision. Malachi's eyes were wide as he finally whispered the question I had been anticipating. They're yours. I nodded subtly, letting the weight of the truth settle over him. These were not random allies, not hired guns or mercenaries. They were my family, my tribe, my people. And they had come because I had called them, because I was no longer willing to endure mockery and dismissal. Otis Clay's voice trembled as he finally found a fragment of courage. What do you want? The words sounded pathetic even to me, a feeble attempt to regain some semblance of control. I allowed myself a small smile, not cruel, but knowing. Control had shifted. Authority had returned to the one who had always deserved it. I want acknowledgement, I said, my voice carrying across the street, clear and unwavering. Acknowledgement that your laughter, your whispers, and your judgments have been misplaced. That I am not defined by your amusement or your ridicule. That my worth is mine to command, not yours to measure. The townspeople stared, frozen, as the words sank in. I could see the ripple of comprehension, fear, and regret passing through them. This was not simply a lesson in humility, it was a revelation of power they could barely grasp. I turned to my brother, and with a subtle gesture, the warriors shifted again. Horses stamped, hooves striking the earth, weapons lifted in unison, not at the town, but in a ceremonial display of alignment and readiness. The town could see now that this was not chaos. This was control. This was authority. And they had no claim to it. Malachi squeezed my hand, grounding himself in my presence. He had always known me as quiet, patient, and unassuming. But now he saw the breadth of my resolve, the depth of my strategy, and the magnitude of my command. He would never doubt me again. Otis Clay stammered, words failing him as he tried to process the magnitude of what he had unleashed. The other townspeople were frozen, some on the verge of tears, others struggling to comprehend that the woman they had mocked was now the one holding power over their very survival. I walked slowly down the main street, boots striking the wooden planks with measured rhythm. Each step was deliberate, a silent declaration that I was no longer the subject of ridicule. That every joke, every mocking glance, every whisper of contempt had only served to bring me to this moment. And then I stopped, halfway down the street, letting my presence dominate the space. I raised my hand once more, and every warrior mirrored the gesture with precision, creating a visual testament to unity, discipline, and unyielding strength. The town's murmurings fell silent. Fear had replaced laughter, awe had replaced contempt. They were beginning to understand. Malachi's voice was barely audible, but I heard it. They'll listen to you, won't they? I nodded once, barely moving my lips. They would. Because I was not asking. I was commanding. And centuries of training, loyalty, and respect had taught them exactly how to respond. Otis Clay collapsed into a chair on the porch of his store, his face pale and trembling. Every insult he had ever thrown in my direction, every laugh he had shared with others, now returned to him in a tidal wave of consequences. He could see it, finally. This was no ordinary woman. I was not the figure he thought he knew. I was far beyond his comprehension. And as the sun reached its zenith, casting long shadows across the town, I felt the culmination of years of patience, planning, and endurance settle into my bones. The town would remember this day, not for the petty arguments or small disputes, but for the awakening of power they had long dismissed. I could feel it in the way the warriors shifted, the way the dust settled in patterns only we understood, the way every heartbeat synchronized with my command. This was no longer about ridicule or judgment. This was about authority, about recognition, about revealing a truth too long hidden. Willow Creek had underestimated me. They had mocked me, dismissed me, and measured me by standards that were never mine to accept. And now, they were about to learn exactly what it meant to face someone who had endured, planned, and waited. The first step in reclaiming what was mine had been taken. And the town, for better or worse, would never forget it. The streets of Willow Creek were silent now, but it was not a peaceful silence. It was the kind that buzzed with uncertainty, thick with the realization that everything the townspeople believed about me had been a lie. Every mocking glance, every whispered joke, every cruel comment, they had underestimated not just a woman, but a force that had been shaped and honed far beyond the reach of their narrow minds. Malachi's hand remained in mine, and I could feel the tension in his fingers, the way his grip tightened with every heartbeat. He had loved me all these years, but now he was seeing a side of me he had never imagined. The quiet, overweight, timid woman he had married was gone. She had been a mask, a carefully constructed camouflage that had allowed me to move unseen, unnoticed, underestimated. That mask had fallen away, and what remained was something both powerful and unstoppable. The warriors behind me shifted again, their movements smooth, precise, almost hypnotic. They were a living testament to discipline and loyalty, each one attuned to my signals, responding without hesitation. Their presence was no longer just protection. It was a message. It said, clearly and unmistakably, that I was not to be challenged, mocked, or doubted. I began to walk down the main street, my boots echoing on the wooden planks, a rhythm that seemed to mark time itself. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated to draw attention, to demonstrate control. The townspeople watched, frozen, unable to look away, unable to move, caught in the gravity of what was unfolding before them. Otis Clay tried to rise from the chair where he had collapsed, but his body betrayed him. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely, leaving only fear and disbelief. He had spent years laughing at me, thinking he was clever, thinking he knew me. And now he was confronted with the undeniable truth. He had been utterly wrong. I raised my hand slightly, and the warriors responded instantly. Horses shifted, riders adjusted, weapons raised not in threat to the town, but as a statement of readiness. They were poised, disciplined, unyielding. The town could feel it, even if they could not comprehend the full meaning. Malachi whispered my name, almost in awe. They really are yours, he said. I gave him a slight nod, my eyes never leaving the crowd. Yes, they were mine. Loyal, trained, disciplined, and unwavering. They had waited for this moment, as I had. The first murmurings of comprehension began to spread through the crowd. A few recognized the emblem I had displayed earlier, Others remembered fragments of stories, legends whispered on the wind, tales that had seemed impossible, exaggerated, or simply untrue. But now, confronted with reality, those whispers gained weight, grew into understanding, and finally, fear. I walked to the center of the street, stopping in front of Otis Clay. His eyes widened in terror as I allowed the full weight of my presence to settle on him. I did not need to raise my voice. My gaze, my posture, my very presence spoke volumes. Every insult he had ever hurled, every joke he had shared with the townspeople, returned to him like a tide of inevitability. I let the silence stretch, savoring the moment, letting it settle into every corner of the town. Then, in a voice that carried across the wooden buildings, steady and unwavering, I spoke. You have judged me for years, measured me by standards that were never yours to apply, and laughed at what you did not understand. Today, you see the consequences of underestimating the strength hidden behind patience and silence. The townspeople shifted uneasily, some clutching one another, others staring as if trying to memorize every detail of this revelation. Children who had once pointed and laughed now clung to their mothers, sensing the shift in power even if they did not fully comprehend it. I gestured subtly toward my brother, and the warriors responded instantly, forming a protective yet commanding formation around the town. They did not threaten, yet the message was unmistakable. Challenge this woman, and you challenge forces you cannot control. Otis Clay stammered, trying again to find words. What do you want? His voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with fear. I smiled slightly, a cold, deliberate curve of lips. Acknowledgement. A public recognition that your laughter, your ridicule, and your judgment were wrong. That you mistook patience for weakness, silence for submission. The words sank into the town like stones thrown into still water, ripples spreading through the crowd, reaching ears that had once ignored me. Fear mingled with awe, regret, and the beginnings of understanding. I began to walk again, moving slowly down the street, boots echoing on the planks, each step deliberate. The warriors mirrored every subtle movement, a living, breathing extension of my will. The town had never seen coordination like this, had never felt the weight of presence so absolute, so commanding. Malachi followed, his steps hesitant but loyal. He had loved me in my quiet years, and now he loved me as the force I truly was. He understood the scope of what I had hidden, the strategy behind my silence, the patience that had brought us to this moment. From the edge of the semicircle, my brother watched, his expression unreadable but attentive. Our connection needed no words. The town could not see the history, the training, the lineage that had brought us here. They only saw the present, and in it, the undeniable authority of a woman they had long dismissed. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the crowd one last time. This town has judged me, I said, voice carrying across the street. But today, it learns the cost of underestimation. Every insult, every mockery, every whispered joke, remember them. They will never be repeated. A wave of acknowledgement passed through the warriors, subtle but unmistakable. They understood that the first step had been taken, that the balance had shifted irrevocably. Willow Creek would never see me the same way again. The air hummed with anticipation, tension, and the quiet knowledge that the town's understanding of power had been irrevocably altered. I had returned, not as the woman they thought they knew, but as a force beyond their comprehension, a reminder that patience, endurance, and strategy could shape power in ways the unobservant could never anticipate. The first lesson had been delivered, and I knew, deep within, that the true reckoning was only just beginning. By mid-afternoon, Willow Creek felt transformed, though nothing about the town itself had changed. The wooden facades, the dusty streets, and the familiar hum of the saloon all remained the same, but the air had shifted. Every person present was aware that the balance of power had been rewritten, that the quiet woman they once ignored now dictated terms no one dared challenge. I could feel the weight of their gazes on me, heavy with fear, awe, and a grudging respect that had taken far too long to form. They were trying to process years of misjudgment in a matter of moments. I let them try. Understanding was a slow and painful process for those who had been blind for so long. Malachi stayed close, his presence grounding me, a reminder that amidst the chaos and tension, there was still loyalty, still someone who knew me beyond appearances. But I had to remain resolute. The warriors behind me were not just my protection, they were my leverage, my silent assertion of authority. Every movement they made, subtle yet deliberate, reinforced the fact that the town was no longer in control. I walked to the center of the street again, letting the sun cast my shadow long across the dusty planks. The wind carried the distant scent of sage and leather from my brother's mounted force, a subtle reminder of the power waiting silently at my command. This was a demonstration, not of aggression, but of inevitability. Every insult, every sneer, every whispered mockery had led to this moment. Otis Clay had retreated further into his store, clinging to the doorframe as if it were a shield against reality. He had tried to command attention with laughter for years, but that laughter had crumbled into trembling whispers. Every glance he cast my way was filled with unspoken pleas, questions he had no courage to articulate. I did not answer him. I had no reason to. My presence, my stance, my history, all of it spoke louder than words ever could. I moved slowly along the street, boots echoing, letting the rhythm of each step draw their eyes. Children who once hid behind skirts and jackets now peeked out with wide eyes, sensing the gravity without fully understanding it. The men, those who had once nodded at Otis's jokes, now fidgeted nervously, recognizing for the first time that their assumptions about me had been catastrophically wrong. Malachi whispered, almost afraid to speak aloud. "Do they understand?" I let a small, almost imperceptible smile curve my lips. Understanding, in the terms they had known, would come slowly. Fear would precede comprehension. And by the time comprehension arrived, they would be forced to acknowledge what they had so recklessly ignored for so long. From the edges of the street, my brother shifted in his saddle, subtle signals passing through the line of warriors. It was a language of glances, slight movements, and disciplined posture that spoke volumes to those trained to interpret it. To the townspeople, it looked like coordination, precision, and power, but they could not fathom the depth of the history, the training, the legacy embedded in every action. I paused, letting the silence settle across the town. The tension was tangible, pressing against the wooden facades, seeping into every home, every shop, every heart. Then, slowly, I spoke again, my voice carrying clear and firm. Willow Creek has seen me as small, weak, and unworthy. You have measured me by the shape of my body, the softness of my voice, and the quiet of my demeanor. Today, you see that these measures were never yours to take. The words spread through the crowd, reverberating, demanding attention. Whispers began to circulate, growing in volume and intensity. Even the bravest of the men, those who had once mocked and laughed with Otis Clay, now looked at one another with unease, their confidence eroded by the undeniable reality before them. A sudden movement on the horizon caught my attention. Dust kicked up in the distance, not from my warriors, not from any routine movement, but from something fast, aggressive, and unrelenting. My gaze sharpened. Bandits. Raiders. Men who sought to take advantage of a quiet, defenseless town. Yet they had miscalculated entirely. I signaled subtly with my hand, and the warriors adjusted instantly, forming a disciplined front that stretched beyond the town's main street. The horses' hooves kicked up dust, a visual warning, a demonstration of readiness. This was no longer a simple display of authority, it was preparation for confrontation. Malachi's voice was low, urgent. "How many are they?" I counted silently, my eyes scanning the horizon with precision. Perhaps 20, maybe more. Heavily armed, fast, confident. They had expected an easy target, a town caught unaware. They would soon discover that they had underestimated both me and the reach of my influence. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The discipline, the precision, the sheer presence of my warriors communicated what words could not. The town's residents began to step back, some instinctively moving toward shelter, others frozen in awe. They were witnessing a display of strategy, coordination, and power that was entirely beyond their comprehension. Otis Clay's eyes were wide, sweat beading on his forehead. He had always assumed that fear and respect could be commanded through arrogance and mockery. He had learned, far too late, that true authority was earned, not taken. And that authority was now standing directly in the center of Willow Creek, silent but commanding, backed by a force that would not waver. The bandits approached with confidence, their voices carrying across the plain, shouting, whooping, expecting fear, expecting chaos. What they received instead was silence, and in that silence, an understanding. They were not facing a town in disarray, but a woman who commanded warriors trained to respond to her every signal. Malachi tightened his grip on my hand, and I felt the tension in his fingers, the awareness of the danger, yet also the trust in the command structure I had orchestrated. He had known my patience and quietude, but now he saw the layers beneath. Years of preparation, of strategy, of endurance that had culminated in this moment. I raised my hand slightly, and the warriors shifted instantly, tightening their formation, hooves striking the earth in a controlled rhythm that echoed across the street. The bandits hesitated. Their confidence faltered. And in that moment, the lesson became clear. This town was no longer theirs to take. Every insult, every mocking glance, every underestimation had led to this inevitable point. Willow Creek had finally come face to face with the reality that strength was not always obvious, patience was not always weakness, and silence could conceal unimaginable power. The first confrontation was near. The outcome was certain. The bandits had chosen poorly, and the cost of their misjudgment would be unforgettable. The wind carried the scent of dust, leather, and tension across Willow Creek, intertwining them in a tangible reminder of what was about to unfold. The town had transformed from a quiet, mocking community into a stage where forces far beyond their comprehension were about to collide. My gaze remained fixed on the approaching riders, each detail of their movement analyzed and catalogued in an instant. Their confidence, their speed, their ignorance, they had assumed ease. They had assumed fear. And they would soon discover their error. Malachi followed closely behind me, his presence a subtle reassurance amidst the chaos. He was still absorbing the enormity of what was happening, watching as the townspeople shifted uncomfortably under the weight of understanding. Every step I took seemed to elongate time itself, the echo of my boots marking the rhythm of inevitability. The first of the bandits reached the outskirts of the main street, and I observed them carefully. Heavy rifles, worn leather, faces hidden behind bandanas, but I noticed the small imperfections, the lack of cohesion, the slight hesitation, the faint uncertainty masked by bravado. Experience had taught me that arrogance was often the enemy of survival, and they had brought it in abundance. I signaled subtly, a mere tilt of the hand, and my warriors responded instantly. Horses adjusted, riders shifted, weapons raised, not yet aimed, but ready, controlled, disciplined. The formation was a perfect lattice of strength, precision, and authority. Every element was under my command, a living extension of my will. From the center of the street, the townspeople could see it, the subtle, almost imperceptible movements that marked mastery. They could feel it in the air, a tension that hummed like electricity, something primal and undeniable. Fear mingled with awe, and understanding slowly crept into their minds. They had not just underestimated me, they had underestimated everything I represented. The leader of the bandits rode slightly ahead of the others, signaling with gestures that were meant to convey confidence, command, and fearlessness. I studied him, noting the tilt of his head, the way his hands gripped the reins, the way his eyes swept across the town with expectation. He believed he could intimidate us. He believed that this town would fall under the weight of his presence. I allowed a slow smile, not malicious, but deliberate, to cross my lips. They had been counting on fear, on chaos, on underestimation. What they had not counted on was patience, strategy, and the precision born of generations of training. Malachi whispered under his breath, barely audible, "Do you think they understand what's coming?" I didn't answer. Understanding was irrelevant. What mattered was readiness, execution, and discipline. They would learn soon enough. I raised my hand, and the warriors shifted again, a subtle but unmistakable adjustment that tightened the formation, created a wall of silent authority. Horses stamped the ground in unison, a percussion that echoed across the main street. Dust rose in small clouds with each measured movement, signaling readiness, signaling consequence. The bandits halted, their initial confidence wavering as the reality of the formation before them became undeniable. They could not see the history behind it, the years of discipline, the lineage of strategy and combat that had produced such a force. But instinct told them enough. This was not a town to be plundered. This was a living, breathing assertion of power. I began to walk slowly down the street, each step deliberate, each movement reinforcing command. Malachi's presence at my side was grounding, a reminder that amidst the orchestration of control, there was loyalty and trust. The townspeople watched, frozen, absorbing each detail, realizing in stages that the woman they had mocked for years had orchestrated an entire reality beyond their understanding. Otis Clay remained in his store, pressed against the doorframe, eyes wide with disbelief. He had laughed at me for years, thinking he commanded reality through ridicule. Now he understood, viscerally, that the world was not his to control, that mockery had no power here. Every step I took amplified that realization, reinforced by the unwavering discipline of my warriors. The bandits made a cautious move forward, testing, probing, perhaps hoping that their sheer numbers would compensate for the uncertainty. But even this minor step was met with precise adjustments. Horses shifted, riders repositioned, weapons subtly raised, creating a lattice of control that extended across the width of the street. The townspeople murmured among themselves, the whispers carrying fear, astonishment, and reluctant admiration. Some recognized fragments of stories, legends of warriors and leaders that had been dismissed as myth. Others simply felt the weight of authority pressing upon them, an invisible force that demanded acknowledgement. I paused, letting the moment stretch. The dust and heat and tension seemed to coalesce into a single pulse, a heartbeat that resonated across the street. Then, in a voice that carried effortlessly over the murmuring crowd, I spoke. This town has judged me, mocked me, and dismissed me. Today, you see the consequences of misunderstanding strength and underestimating patience. Every insult, every whisper, every sneer has brought you to this moment. The bandits faltered, their confidence waning as they processed the deliberate calm of my words, the absolute command demonstrated through the warrior's formation. For a brief instant, I felt the weight of history behind me, the generations of training, the lineage of authority, the quiet patience that had been honed to perfection. Malachi's grip on my hand tightened slightly, a silent acknowledgement of shared purpose. He understood the stakes, the gravity, the inevitability of what was about to unfold. The bandits had entered the wrong stage, challenged the wrong authority, and were about to face the consequences of their arrogance. From the edges of the formation, my brother observed, a silent sentinel, prepared to execute orders without hesitation. The coordination, the discipline, the precision, all of it ready to respond at the slightest signal. The town was witnessing not chaos, but controlled power, an orchestration that none of them had been prepared to see. I took another step forward, boots striking the wooden planks with a deliberate rhythm, echoing across the street. The bandits' hesitation grew. Their underestimation of both me and my warriors was becoming their defining error. The first real move would soon be made. And when it came, the lesson would be unforgettable. Willow Creek had witnessed the strength that patience could conceal, the power that silence could command, and the authority that came from preparation, lineage, and discipline. The approaching riders had slowed now, uncertainty creeping into their movement. Their confidence had been shaken by the display, by the silent but unmistakable control we exercised over the street. Dust swirled at their hooves, but it no longer symbolized dominance, it was a warning. I felt the heat of the sun on my back, but it was nothing compared to the surge of adrenaline coursing through me. Years of quiet endurance had prepared me for this moment. Every insult, every mocking glance, every whispered joke now coalescing into clarity and resolve. My body, often ridiculed for its size, carried the weight of authority that no single rider could ignore. Malachi stayed at my side, his gaze fixed on the bandits, calculating, apprehensive, yet rooted in trust. He had known the quiet version of me, the one who walked past scorn and whispered insults, who smiled without understanding their cruelty. But today, He witnessed the other side. The presence that commanded respect, the authority that could bend a small town, and an approaching threat to the will of discipline. The first of the bandit leader's men stepped forward, a test, perhaps, of courage or nerve. The air was thick, charged with tension, as the dust from their horses mingled with the dry heat of the street. My warriors shifted in a subtle display of readiness, the faintest movements visible only to those trained to notice them. I let them come a little closer, letting the small measure of control they still assumed they had erode further. With each step they took, the distance between arrogance and reality narrowed, and I savored the tension, the understanding that years of ridicule had brought us to this precise moment. The townspeople watched from behind windows, doors, and fences, their faces pale, their breaths held. The transformation in their perception was tangible. They could see strength and authority in a woman they had dismissed, mocked, and undervalued for years. It was a revelation born from patience, strategy, and unyielding confidence. From the line of warriors, my brother shifted slightly, signaling adjustments that kept the formation flexible, responsive, ready to react instantly. Every movement had purpose, every glance carried communication, and every sound of hooves struck a rhythm that mirrored the tension rising in the street. The bandit leader, sensing hesitation among his men, raised his hand to signal advance, attempting to regain a semblance of command. I studied him, noting the subtle faltering in his confidence, the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had assumed dominance, believed he could intimidate a town with brute force and bravado. He had assumed wrong. I allowed myself a small smile, sharp and deliberate, and my voice carried across the street, calm yet commanding. You came here expecting a town to crumble, expecting fear to control your path. What you face is not fear, it is authority, discipline, and consequence. The murmurs among my warriors were barely audible, whispers of readiness, adjustments in stance, subtle shifts in the horses' positions. To the townspeople, it was precision. To the bandits, it was an omen. The first clash would define the outcome, but I did not need to signal the attack. The discipline, the presence, the cohesion of my line alone was sufficient to control the situation. Their movements faltered, the rhythm of their advance broken, hesitation spreading like a virus through their ranks. I walked forward, boots striking the dusty street, my shadow stretching long and commanding over the boards. Malachi stayed a step behind, observing, trusting, understanding the layers of strategy and patience I had cultivated for this day. The bandits' faces reflected confusion, fear, and the slow dawning realization that they had underestimated me. From the periphery, my brother gave the smallest signal, and the warriors adjusted, encircling the bandits with a precision that was almost imperceptible but profoundly effective. Horses shifted, riders repositioned, weapons poised, not yet fired, but the latent threat radiated outward, shaping the space, defining the terms of engagement. The town remained silent, observing, absorbing, learning. They witnessed the power of restraint, the authority of patience, the strength in what they had once considered weakness. Every step I took reinforced the lesson, a subtle demonstration of how perception and reality could diverge so drastically. The bandit leader hesitated, realizing that the street was no longer theirs to command, that the narrative of dominance they had assumed had been entirely rewritten. His men faltered, questioning their advance, sensing the inevitability that had been silently crafted by years of preparation, experience, and lineage. I paused, letting the tension linger, letting the inevitability of consequence settle across the town. My voice broke the silence once more, unwavering and precise. You came to rob, to intimidate, to claim what was not yours. That choice ends here. Every step you took under the assumption of weakness has brought you to the edge of error, and today, you will understand why strength can be hidden, patience can be a weapon, and authority can come from those you least expect. A subtle signal from my hand, a shift in formation, and the warriors responded instantly. Horses shifted, hooves striking with controlled rhythm, weapons adjusting with silent precision. The message was clear: retreat is an option, but submission is not. The first encounter was imminent. The lessons would be swift and undeniable. Willow Creek, once a stage for ridicule, was now a canvas for strategy, authority, and consequence. And at the center of it all stood the woman they had mocked, laughed at, and underestimated, a presence that commanded respect, fear, and awe in equal measure. The first gunshots echoed across Willow Creek, not wild or chaotic, but precise, controlled, and purposeful. My warriors responded immediately, each movement deliberate, each action calculated to neutralize the threat without unnecessary risk. The bandits had expected chaos. What they found was discipline, strategy, and lethal precision. I moved through the center of the street, boots hitting the boards with rhythm and authority. The weight of my presence, the confidence I carried, reverberated through the town, resonating in the tense silence of its people. Malachi stayed at my side, his jaw clenched, eyes wide, absorbing every detail, every calculation, every subtle adjustment I made. The bandits, caught off guard by our preparation, faltered. Their initial confidence was shattered, replaced by confusion and fear. Every advance they attempted was met with an immediate, coordinated response. Horses shifted, riders maneuvered with unerring precision, and the sound of disciplined hooves and commands cut through the air like a sharpened blade. From the edge of the street, I could see the panic spreading among the bandits. Their leader, trying to regain control, shouted orders that were barely audible over the rising chaos. His men hesitated, unsure whether to follow or flee, as our formation tightened, compressing them into an ever smaller space where their numbers counted for nothing. I raised my hand, signaling a subtle adjustment. The warriors responded instantly, repositioning, creating barriers and lines that channeled the attackers into predictable patterns. Every movement was calculated, designed to maximize leverage, minimize risk, and demonstrate authority. The bandits had entered a battlefield without understanding its terrain, without recognizing the command structure that dictated every response. Malachi whispered under his breath, "I've never seen anything like this." I didn't answer, my focus on the flow of the engagement, reading movements, anticipating reactions, predicting errors. Years of preparation, every insult endured, every mocking glance absorbed, they all converged into a single moment of clarity and control. The first bandit to break formation stumbled, his horse skidding in the dust, and my warriors adjusted instantly, isolating him, neutralizing him with precision. There was no chaos, no panic, only controlled, lethal authority. The lesson was clear: arrogance, recklessness, and underestimation would be punished. The townspeople watched from behind fences, doors, and windows, their faces pale, their breaths held. They had mocked me, laughed at me, dismissed me, yet now they witnessed the full measure of strength, strategy, and authority that had been concealed behind patience and silence. Fear and awe intertwined, as they realized that every whisper, every joke, every act of cruelty had underestimated a power beyond their comprehension. I moved closer to the center of the street, maintaining eye contact with the bandit leader. His bravado was crumbling, the pretense of control was fading with each passing second. The dust and noise, the hooves and shouts, the controlled ferocity of my warriors, it all culminated in a force that could not be ignored. Malachi stayed a step behind me, observing, understanding, trusting. He had seen the quiet, reserved version of me for years, yet today, he witnessed the embodiment of command and authority, a force that reshaped the very space around us. From the periphery, my brother executed a subtle maneuver, shifting our line, creating a corridor that forced the remaining bandits into an untenable position. Horses responded instantly, forming barriers, directing movement, containing the threat. The precision of every adjustment was invisible to the untrained eye but unmistakable in effect. The bandit leader made a final, desperate charge, trying to rally his men, to reclaim some semblance of control. But it was too late. Our formation was complete, every move anticipated, every reaction accounted for. The moment his horse entered the corridor, the coordinated response enveloped him. Riders flanked him, blocking escape, weapons poised with silent authority. I watched, every sense focused, every calculation precise. This was the culmination of years, the embodiment of patience and discipline. The bandits were learning, finally, the consequences of arrogance, the cost of underestimating strength concealed behind silence. Malachi whispered again, this time louder. "It's over for them. They don't stand a chance." I nodded subtly, though my eyes never left the battlefield, my focus unbroken. The lesson was being delivered, slowly but inexorably, to every man, woman, and child in the street. The standoff ended as quickly as it began. The bandits, their confidence shattered, their numbers irrelevant, surrendered or fled. My warriors maintained formation, ensuring none could escape without consequence. The authority I embodied radiated outward, a force field of respect, fear, and undeniable power. Willow Creek was silent once more, the aftermath thick with tension, dust, and awe. The townspeople absorbed the reality of what they had witnessed. The woman they had mocked, humiliated, and dismissed for years had commanded an army, orchestrated a battle, and asserted authority in a way that none of them could have imagined. Malachi stepped beside me, his voice quiet, reverent. You did all this. You controlled it all. I allowed a small smile, acknowledging the truth. Years of endurance, patience, and hidden strength had brought us to this moment. The lesson was complete, and it would be remembered, long after the dust settled, long after fear had faded, as a testament to the power of underestimated strength. The townspeople emerged slowly, their expressions a mixture of awe, disbelief, and grudging respect. For the first time, they saw me not as the woman they had mocked, but as a leader, a strategist, a force that demanded recognition. And in that recognition, there was understanding. The mistakes of the past had led them to this revelation, and there was no undoing what they had witnessed. The dust hung heavy in the air, settling over Willow Creek like a tangible reminder of what had just unfolded. Silence had returned to the town, but it was no ordinary quiet. It was the silence that follows revelation, that lingers after fear has met authority, after arrogance has been confronted with undeniable power. The streets were filled with the muted sound of horses shifting, the low murmur of my warriors repositioning, and the soft, uncertain footsteps of townspeople who had been forced to confront the truth about me. I stood at the center of the street, boots firmly planted on the wooden planks, the weight of every glance, every whisper, every laugh I had endured pressing against me. But this time, it did not oppress. It empowered. The years of mockery, of ridicule, of isolation, had all been training in a different kind of strength, a patience honed to precision, a resilience that no amount of cruelty could break. Today, that strength had revealed itself in full force. Malachi remained by my side, silent now, but the tight grip of his hand and the steadying presence of his shoulder spoke volumes. He had witnessed the transformation, the emergence of the woman he had always loved into someone far greater, someone the world was compelled to respect. He had seen the truth. The quiet, fat, unassuming woman of Willow Creek was not weak. She had been waiting, always waiting, and now, her patience had shaped reality. The townspeople began to stir, stepping cautiously from behind fences, doors, and windows. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some whispered apologies under their breath, others simply stared, too stunned to form words. They had mocked me, laughed at me, dismissed me as incapable, insignificant, invisible, and yet, all the while, they had been ignorant of the magnitude of what they had underestimated. Otis Clay, ever the loudmouth, ever the instigator, remained frozen near the doorway of his store. His usual arrogance had evaporated, replaced by fear and realization. Every word of mockery he had ever spoken now seemed absurd, ridiculous in the face of the control, the command, the authority I had displayed. His voice faltered as he attempted to speak. What do you want from us? I looked at him, my gaze steady, unwavering, and for a moment, I allowed the faintest trace of the years of quiet suffering to flicker in my expression. Then, slowly, deliberately, I spoke. I want acknowledgement. I want every insult, every laugh, every act of cruelty recognized for what it was. I want you to understand that strength is not always visible, that authority does not require permission, and that patience can be more dangerous than any weapon you could carry. Today, you have witnessed that lesson. Remember it. The silence that followed was profound. My words had not demanded compliance, they had demanded understanding. And in that understanding, the town realized the depth of their misjudgment. Every eye in Willow Creek turned to me, to the woman they had underestimated for years, and in that gaze was fear, respect, and awe. My brother stepped forward, moving among the warriors with a quiet authority that mirrored my own. He ensured the perimeter remained secure, that the bandits who had fled would not return, that the lesson was reinforced not through brute force, but through controlled presence. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. I turned back to Malachi, taking his hand, feeling the warmth of his steady grip. "We've endured long enough," I murmured. "They will remember this. They will not forget what they have seen." He nodded, understanding more than I could express in words. The partnership we shared, forged in quiet years of love and patience, had found its full expression in this moment. The townspeople began to approach cautiously, some timidly, others with newfound respect. A few of the older women, who had once whispered insults behind my back, stepped forward, their faces marked by regret. I allowed them to see that I was not vengeful, but I was resolute. Respect, not fear, would be the foundation of the new understanding in Willow Creek. Otis Clay, finally finding his voice, stammered an apology, halting and incomplete, yet sincere enough to be recognized. I did not celebrate his words, but I acknowledged them with a nod. The lesson had been learned, arrogance and cruelty had consequences, and underestimation was no shield against the force of patience and hidden strength. The bandits, scattered and fleeing, had been neutralized not through chaos, but through calculated authority. They would carry the story of Willow Creek far beyond its borders, the tale of a town confronted not by a hero wielding brute force, but by a woman whose strength was measured in endurance, strategy, and the command of respect. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of the victory, not just over the bandits, but over years of scorn, dismissal, and ridicule. Every mocking glance, every cruel word, had led to this moment of undeniable affirmation. Malachi squeezed my hand, his eyes reflecting pride, wonder, and the quiet realization that the woman he had married was far more formidable than he had ever imagined. Together, we walked slowly down the main street, past the silent townspeople, past the dust that still hung heavy in the air, past the remnants of arrogance that had thought they could define me. Willow Creek had changed that day, not because of fear, not because of intimidation, but because of the revelation of true strength. And I, the woman they had dismissed as insignificant, fat, and unremarkable, had become its undeniable measure. My presence alone now defined the terms, and every step forward carried the weight of experience, endurance, and unyielding authority. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and earth, and with it came understanding. The town would never again judge by appearances, never again mock without consequence, never again underestimate the quiet strength of a woman who had endured, waited, and ultimately commanded respect. As night fell over Willow Creek, the street emptied slowly, leaving only my warriors, Malachi, and me. The lessons had been delivered. The consequences understood. The power unchallenged. And in that quiet aftermath, a truth settled deeply in every heart present. Never judge what you do not know, and never underestimate patience, resolve, and the quiet strength that can shape destiny. I turned to Malachi, letting the faintest smile cross my lips. "This is just the beginning," I said, though the weight of years past made the words feel heavier than they sounded. He nodded, understanding that the days ahead would be guided not by fear, but by the authority and resolve that had defined this day. Willow Creek would remember, and I would ensure they did. She endured years of mockery, humiliation, and doubt, and yet, when the moment came, she stood unbroken, commanding respect and reshaping her world. If you were in her place, would you have found the strength to fight back the same way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the other videos on your screen now.